Beneath the glittering chandeliers of New York's Gilded Age, one woman's life was sold to shadows of duty and despair. A poor schoolteacher, with nothing but her mother's frail health to protect, agrees to a marriage of convenience with a man she believes to be a dying merchant. But on that fateful night, Josephine Carter discovers a breathtaking truth. Her husband is heir to one of America's greatest empires. From that moment, love and betrayal, loyalty and ambition collide in a story where every glance hides a secret and every silence conceals a storm. Where are you listening from? And tell me, what do you love most about period romances filled with passion and unexpected turns? New York City, early spring of 1882. The air carried the final chill of winter, its breath weaving through alleyways and brick facades like the memory of something that refused to be forgotten. On the east side of the city, far from the gaslit mansions of Fifth Avenue, Miss Josephine Carter pulled her threadbare shawl closer around her shoulders as she descended the stone steps of St. Agnes Girls' School for what she knew would be the last time. The sound of the bell no longer stirred the hopeful murmur of young voices within. The classrooms had emptied, and with them, her reason to endure. She had taught literature and penmanship to daughters of dockworkers and seamstresses for nearly 7 years, offering more than lessons, offering dignity. But this morning, the headmistress had summoned her with downcast eyes and folded hands. "There are pressures beyond our walls, Miss Carter. A new board, new priorities." She had not needed to say more. Josephine's modest salary and outspoken nature had long painted her as dispensable. And so, with a final nod to the silent corridors, she walked out with her books pressed tightly to her chest and her heart unraveling at the seams. By the time she reached the boarding house on Eldridge Street, the early light had waned into the dull amber of approaching dusk. A cough, dry and persistent, echoed from within. Her mother's illness had worsened, the apothecary's tinctures had grown thinner, the rent heavier, and now with no income, Josephine faced a void she could no longer ignore. She sat beside the small iron bed where her mother, Agnes Carter, lay wrapped in blankets, her once strong voice now barely more than a whisper. Josephine held her hand in silence, willing herself not to cry. The room smelled of chamomile and old paper. The wallpaper peeled like brittle skin, and the fire in the grate had long turned to ash. That night, as snow began to fall again over the city like a cruel joke from winter's hand, a letter arrived, delivered not by post, but by a man in a dark coat who refused to give his name. The envelope bore no return address. The seal was heavy wax, crimson as blood. Inside, the letter was brief, but its contents caused her hands to tremble. "Miss Carter, you are known for your virtue, your discretion, and your devotion to your mother. A gentleman of considerable means, whose health has rendered him unable to pursue companionship by traditional means, seeks a wife of character, not beauty, not lineage, but heart. Should you be inclined to accept such a union, you will be granted immediate financial security, a private residence, and care for your mother for the remainder of her days. A carriage will be sent in 3 days' time. If you are willing, be ready. No signature, no name." She read the letter thrice by candlelight, the flame flickering with each exhale she did not realize she was holding. Her mind swirled with questions, but none had answers. Only a rising wave of desperation and a quiet voice inside her that whispered, "There is no other way." 3 days later, dressed in her best muslin dress, an ivory garment long outdated and hemmed anew, Josephine stood before the window of a townhouse she had never seen before, on a street where carriages gleamed and gas lamps burned like golden stars. The carriage that had fetched her bore a crest she did not recognize, and the footman had spoken only twice. Once to confirm her name, once to say, "We have arrived." Inside the drawing room, silence reigned. Dark wood paneling swallowed the light, and every object, from the marble hearth to the oil portraits above, seemed to observe her with cool indifference. Then the door opened, and he stepped in. Theodore Ashland. He was taller than she expected. Though his frame was lean beneath the rich folds of his black wool coat, his face was pale, the skin drawn but not gaunt. There was an elegance to the way he held himself, as though used to commanding rooms without raising his voice. His eyes, grey, clear, unreadable, met hers with startling directness. For a moment they stood in silence. Then he bowed. "Miss Carter." His voice was low and precise, not cold but careful. Every word seemed measured like a man accustomed to being misunderstood. She curtsied, her breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Ashland, please, let us dispense with pretenses. I'm not here to court you. I'm here to make you an offer." He gestured to the chair but remained standing. She sat. "I am in poor health," he said simply. "Doctors do not expect my condition to improve. I have neither time nor patience for society's games. I require a wife in name, in form, and in appearance. I will not demand your affection, only your loyalty. In return, you will have all the comfort and care your mother requires. She may live with you. You will never want for anything again." Josephine's hands clasped in her lap, trembling faintly. "And the purpose of this marriage, sir?" His lips curved slightly, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "Protection. A man in my position needs a shield. The presence of a wife, especially one with your reputation, will silence questions I do not wish answered. And perhaps," he paused, "perhaps I am tired of being alone." Something in his voice then, the crack beneath the surface, made Josephine's heart ache without permission. She rose, slowly. "I ask only that you treat me with honesty and decency." His gaze held hers. "I can promise that." A notary was summoned. Papers were signed, no rings exchanged, no witnesses save the fire and the ticking clock on the mantel. She was given a key. He offered her no kiss, only a quiet nod. That night, Josephine lay awake in the guest chamber of Ashland Manor, staring at the velvet-draped ceiling. The bed was soft, the linens were embroidered. A single candle flickered on the nightstand beside a sealed envelope. Her mother's medical care had already been arranged. A private physician would visit in the morning, and still she felt like a trespasser in a story that did not belong to her. She did not know him. He did not know her. They had bound their lives with signatures and silence, but in the quiet hours before dawn, she rose and walked barefoot to the window. Outside, the snow had ceased. The city, gilded in moonlight, stretched before her like a stage waiting for its curtain to rise, and somewhere in the room across the hall, her husband, by name alone, breathed in solitude. She did not yet know the secrets this house held, nor the power of the name she had taken, only that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Ashland Manor rose like a monument of silence at the edge of Fifth Avenue, its tall arched windows veiled by thick burgundy drapery, and its wrought-iron gates always closed to the world beyond. To the passers-by, it was simply another stone giant of Manhattan's northern stretch, grand, aloof, impenetrable. But to Josephine Carter, who crossed its threshold as a wife in name but not in heart, it felt like a place where time had forgotten to breathe. The carriage that had returned for her was lined with velvet and pulled by a pair of black horses, whose hooves echoed solemnly through the cobblestone streets. The driver spoke not a word, and the footman who opened the door at the manor gave only a shallow nod before disappearing behind her. The marble-floored foyer greeted her with cold indifference. Above her head, a chandelier of crystal teardrops hung from a vaulted ceiling, its brilliance dimmed by the late afternoon gloom. Paintings of ships at sea, some placid, others caught in storms, adorned the hall, and their gilded frames gleamed like relics of a golden age now faded. A maid in grey with hair pulled so tightly it seemed to smooth the years from her brow, stepped forward. "Mrs. Ashland," she said with a curtsy, the title falling with strange finality on Josephine's ears. "I am Miriam, the housekeeper. You will find your rooms prepared." "My mother, has she been—" "She arrived an hour ago," Miriam replied without emotion. "She is resting in the East Wing under the care of Dr. Bellamy." Josephine closed her eyes briefly, the tension in her chest easing. That singular reassurance, her mother safely cared for, was the only solid ground beneath her feet. She was led through a long corridor where the scent of beeswax polish lingered, and her footsteps echoed against the parquet floors. Every corner seemed too pristine, every surface untouched. It was a house preserved, not lived in. The room assigned to her was elegant beyond imagination. A canopied bed of carved mahogany dominated the space, draped in ivory damask. A writing desk faced the tall windows, and a dressing table lined with silver-handled brushes waited for a mistress she never imagined becoming. Miriam gestured to the bell pull near the bed. "If you require anything, madam." Josephine turned. "Where is Mr. Ashland?" "He keeps his own quarters. You will not be expected to share space unless he expresses otherwise." The answer stung more than it should have. Josephine gave a quiet nod, and Miriam retreated, her presence like the closing of a door behind a locked life. That evening, as dusk sank the city into shadow, Josephine stood alone at her window. Gaslights flickered across the avenue. Far off, carriages rolled by with lamps glowing faintly in the fog. She had known loneliness before, but not like this, not in such wealth, not in such silence. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was not a servant. Theodore stood at the door, his expression unreadable. He wore a dark velvet jacket and a pale cravat, loose at the throat, as though formality wearied him. The candle in the hall behind him cast a golden line along his cheekbone, illuminating the tension in his face. "I hope the room is to your satisfaction," he said. "It is more than I ever expected," she replied softly. He stepped into the room, his presence commanding despite the fragile air about him. "You may move freely about the house. I only ask that you refrain from entering the West Wing. My offices are there." There was no accusation in his tone, merely caution, yet it carried the unspoken truth. There were boundaries, and she was expected not to cross them. "I understand," she said. They stood in silence for a moment. Then, with a faint incline of his head, he turned to go. "Theodore." He paused. Josephine's voice wavered. "May I ask, why me?" His back remained turned. "Because you were the only one who didn't ask for more than what I could give." And then he was gone, the quiet click of the door sounding louder than it should have. Later that night, long after the house had retired into its usual stillness, Josephine sat by the fire, her hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the flames. Somewhere beyond the corridor, the sound of distant coughing broke the silence. It was dry, hoarse, drawn from the chest. Her breath caught. She stepped into the hall, barefoot, guided only by the flickering sconces along the walls. The cough sounded again, followed by a muffled groan. Following instinct more than propriety, she moved toward the noise. It led her to a door left ajar. Within, Theodore was doubled over on a settee, one hand bracing himself against the carved armrest, the other clutched at his chest. Sweat clung to his brow, and his breath came in short, sharp bursts. Josephine crossed the threshold without thought. "Theodore!" He looked up, startled, pain clouding his features. "You shouldn't—" "Hush!" She knelt before him, one hand to his forehead. He was burning. "There's medicine," he murmured. "On the desk, in the vial." She found it quickly, a glass vial half filled with dark liquid, and brought it to his lips. He resisted for a moment. Pride, perhaps, but then relented. As he drank, his breathing began to slow. The tightness in his chest eased by fractions. "You should have called someone," she whispered. He shook his head. "I don't like being seen like this." "Then allow me to be the exception." His eyes met hers. In that moment, raw and unguarded, he was not a millionaire, not a master of empire or a name whispered in parlors. He was a man, tired, in pain, and desperately alone. She stood and reached for a cloth, dabbing his forehead gently, her fingers brushing his temple. He did not flinch. His eyes closed. "Why do you help me?" he asked, voice barely audible. because I know what it is to suffer in silence." She stayed with him until he slept, her hand resting lightly on his. And in the flicker of candlelight, surrounded by the heavy velvet of a stranger's house, she realized something had shifted. Not in him, in her. A man she had married out of desperation had become something more complex than the letters and legal documents had promised. There was warmth behind the frost, and pain behind the poise. She left the room quietly, closing the door with reverence. And as she returned to her chambers, Josephine knew that something unspoken now bound them. Not love, not yet, but something undeniable. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a story waiting to begin. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashland Manor like a pale benediction, casting faint gold upon the polished floorboards and velvet draperies. Outside, the city stirred with carriages rattling over the stones and the distant clang of streetcars beginning their day. But inside the great house, silence remained sovereign. Josephine sat alone in the solarium, a room so rarely used it still smelled faintly of lavender sachets sealed away seasons ago. Sunlight spilled across the patterned tiles at her feet, warming her hands where they rested on her lap. She held a book she hadn't turned in over half an hour. Her eyes, though fixed on the page, were elsewhere. Since that night, since the moment she had knelt beside Theodore in his pain, something within her had remained unsettled. Not in fear, not in regret, but in awareness. Awareness of a man she had not expected to care for. A man who suffered in silence, who hid pieces of himself behind impeccable manners and restrained conversation. The manor's staff continued to treat her with polite detachment. They moved like shadows, respectful but distant, as though she had yet to earn her place among them. The only exception was an older footman named Harold, whose soft eyes lingered on her with the faint recognition of someone who had once believed in kindness. It was Harold's voice she heard now, carrying faintly through the corridor as he spoke near the butler's pantry. "She's too decent for this farce. I'll say it again," Harold murmured. "She thinks she married a sick merchant with a small inheritance, doesn't even know he owns half the Atlantic fleet." "Hush, Harold," came the sharper whisper of Miriam the housekeeper. "If Mr. Ashland hears you, he won't. He's too busy with his bloody ledgers and pretending this woman's just a placeholder. Meanwhile, the board grows restless, and Miss Evelyn's eyeing the whole estate like it's hers by birthright." Josephine froze, her fingers tightening around the spine of her book. Half the Atlantic fleet. The words rang like a bell inside her. And more than the claim, it was the ease with which it was said, the casual certainty in Harold's voice. Not rumor, not exaggeration, truth. She rose slowly, her breath shallow. The house was still. The staff moved away, their voices fading into the hush. She crossed the solarium and walked the halls with purpose, her slippers silent against the parquet floor. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with growing clarity. She had been lied to. The door to Theodore's study stood slightly ajar. He had told her once, calmly but firmly, that the West Wing was private. She had respected that, until now. She hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering above the doorknob, and then, with one decisive motion, she pushed it open. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a pair of brass lamps on either end of an enormous mahogany desk. Papers lay scattered across the surface, maps pinned to the walls, some marked with inked roots, and the names of distant ports, Charleston, Havana, Liverpool, Boston. In the center of it all sat Theodore Ashland. He looked up slowly, as though he had expected her. "Josephine," he said, his voice quiet. "I overheard the staff," she said. No preamble, no attempt at decorum. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her with a slight tremor. "You own Ashland Shipping." His eyes did not flinch. "Yes. You are not a sick man clinging to a small estate. You are heir to one of the largest maritime empires in this country." "That is also true." The silence that followed was heavy. "You let me believe you were a merchant," she whispered, her tone growing tight. You let me walk into this house thinking I was marrying a man of modest means, a man who needed companionship, not protection from scandal. I never said I wasn't those things, he replied, rising from his chair. You assumed modesty, and I did not correct you. Why? The word cracked out of her like a whip. Why deceive me? He stepped closer, his face unreadable, but his voice was low and raw. Because if I had told you the truth, you would have questioned your own reasons. You would have wondered if you were doing it for money, or pity, or the fantasy of becoming someone's savior. Tears burned behind her eyes, not from sorrow, but from humiliation. And now I wonder if I was chosen simply because I'm convenient, she said bitterly. A poor girl with no social standing, someone who wouldn't ask questions. That's what they wanted, he said, his voice harder now. That's what my family demanded. Evelyn, the board, the vultures circling this house. They didn't want me to marry someone of society. They feared a match born of passion, someone with ambition. You, they thought, would be silent, harmless. She stared at him. And what did you think, Theodore? For the first time his composure faltered. He looked down, hands braced on the desk. I thought you had dignity, he said barely above a whisper. I thought you had compassion, that perhaps, if I were to die, you would mourn me not as a husband but as a man. Her throat tightened. He looked up again, and this time there was no shield in his eyes. You were the only woman I believed would look at me and not see the empire. Only the man behind it. Josephine backed away. And yet you gave me a name I never earned, a title I never understood, and surrounded me with strangers who treat me like an intruder in your palace. That was not my intention. No, she said bitterly. Your intention was never to let me in at all. She turned from him and left the study, the sound of her departure like a gust of wind slamming through a cathedral. Back in her chambers, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it, chest heaving. The walls, the silk furnishings, the shining mirror, all felt foreign, a stage set, a cage. She walked to the window. The view unchanged, Fifth Avenue in quiet bustle, the city unaware of her aching humiliation. She had thought herself clever, selfless even, believing that in marrying a quiet, ill man, she was saving herself and her mother. But now she saw the cruelty of the arrangement. The way she had been used as a symbol of virtue, a pawn to secure appearances, while the truth was hidden behind locked doors and careful silences. And yet, she could not forget the way he had looked at her in that moment. Not with arrogance, but with something closer to fear. Not of her, of being seen. The candle on her bedside table flickered as she sat down, her fingers twisting in the folds of her skirt. Her breath was shallow. Her heart was loud. She had entered this house as a woman with nothing to lose, and now, for reasons she did not yet understand, she felt as though something had been torn from her. Not love, not yet, but something had begun. And now she could not turn away from it. The chandeliers of New York's high society glittered brighter than the stars that failed to pierce the haze of coal smoke above the city. Beneath their opulent glow, crystal clinked, laughter echoed, and secrets were passed as softly as perfume. And now, Josephine Carter Ashland stood in the midst of it all, draped in silk, corseted in elegance, but no less out of place than a sparrow caged among peacocks. Her first appearance as Mrs. Ashland was at a charity reception for the Metropolitan Orphans Guild, held in the grand ballroom of the Pembroke estate. The invitation had arrived addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Ashland, sealed in gold wax, accompanied by a discreet note penned by Evelyn herself. It will be expected of you to attend. The family must be seen united. Do wear something suitable. Suitable. Josephine had stood staring at those words longer than she would later admit. On the night of the reception, Miriam laid out a gown sent by one of Evelyn's favoured couturiers, pale lilac satin with silver threading along the hem, a colour delicate enough to imply humility but rich enough to avoid insult. The corset, tighter than any she had worn before, pressed against her ribs with each breath, as if reminding her not to forget where she stood. Theodore appeared just before they were to depart, dressed in a midnight blue tailcoat with onyx studs. He said nothing at first, only looked at her as though she were a question he did not know how to answer. "You look," he began, but the words failed him. "Suitable," she offered, her voice level. He flinched, almost imperceptibly. "No, you look brave." The carriage ride to the Pembroke estate passed in silence, but not an uncomfortable one. Rather, it was filled with something suspended, fragile, like the pause between a bowstring drawn and released. When they entered the ballroom, all conversation seemed to halt for a heartbeat before resuming at double speed. Eyes turned, fans fluttered, smiles widened into something brittle and bloodless. Josephine walked by Theodore's side, chin high, shoulders back. The music was sweet and unassuming, a string quartet playing beneath a dome painted with cherubs and constellations. The walls were lined with portraits of women with swan necks and powdered shoulders. Evelyn approached them, resplendent in emerald green silk that clung to her like armor. Her smile was the kind that cut. "My dear Josephine," she said, kissing the air beside Josephine's cheek. "What a vision! I see Madame Lefebvre managed to perform a miracle." Josephine smiled gently. She had excellent raw material to work with. A flicker passed through Evelyn's eyes, quickly masked by practiced charm. "Do allow me to introduce you to the ladies of our circle." What followed was not so much an introduction as a slow, deliberate parade. Names were exchanged. Mrs. Pembroke, Lady Ashton, the young widow Rowena Alcott, but every hand Josephine took was cold, every curtsy shallow, every compliment thinly veiled condescension. They commented on her posture, her diction, the modesty of her gloves, always with smiles, always with veiled precision. "She taught at St. Agnes, did you know?" one whispered, just loud enough. "How noble," murmured another. "To come from such simple beginnings." "I'm told she reads poetry," said a third, as if it were a charming disease. By the end of the evening, Josephine's cheeks ached from smiling, her back ached from standing, and her spirit ached from something she could not yet name. Back at Ashland Manor, she removed her gloves with trembling fingers. Theodore stood watching her from the threshold of her chamber. "I should not have made you go," he said quietly. "You didn't," she replied. "She did." "She cannot touch you." Josephine turned slowly. "She already has, and you let her." For a long time, neither of them moved. Then, with a weary breath, he said only, "Good night, Josephine," and vanished into the shadows of the corridor. The days that followed brought more invitations. Dinners, teas, garden parties, each event a minefield of expectation and silent judgment. Josephine attended as required, performed her role with grace, but each night she returned more hollow. The worst of it came not from the women, but from the quiet knowledge that Theodore did not defend her, not publicly, not yet. And then, as though life itself conspired to test the limits of her endurance, Agnes fell ill once more. It began with a cough, then fever, then trembling hands that dropped the teacup she tried to lift. Josephine summoned Miriam. Miriam summoned the house physician. "He's with Mr. Ashland," the maid said. "I'll inform him after the board meeting." But hours passed. Agnes's breathing worsened. Her skin turned pale and damp, and Josephine, her gown soaked with worry, her sleeves rolled, her hair undone, descended the stairs in search of Theodore. She found Evelyn first. "Where is he?" Josephine asked, voice taut. Evelyn smiled sweetly. "Occupied. The family has more pressing concerns at the moment. My mother may be dying. And yet you came from nothing. I doubt the physician's visit was part of the marriage agreement." The words struck with precision. Josephine staggered back half a step, her breath caught in her throat. "Please," she whispered. Evelyn's expression did not change. "I'll see what I can do." That evening, Theodore came to her room. She was seated beside Agnes's bed, holding a cloth to her mother's brow. Her face was pale, and when she looked up at him, something inside her was already broken. "I didn't know," he said. "I asked for so little," she murmured. "Just that she be cared for. I thought that was part of the bargain." "It was," he said hoarsely, "and it will be again. She needs a real doctor. She needs warmth. Not this house, not this silence." Theodore knelt beside her. "Then I will bring her light." He rose and left the room without another word. Within the hour, a new physician arrived. With him came medicines, linens, warm compresses. Fire was stoked, candles lit, and for the first time since entering Ashland Manor, Josephine felt something like hope take root. As dawn broke over the city, golden and quiet, Theodore returned. He stood at the doorframe, watching as Josephine, half asleep, sat by her mother's side. "You should rest," he said. "I can't." He hesitated. "She will recover. You saved her." Josephine looked at him, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "You could have saved her sooner." "I was trying to save you both." "From what?" He didn't answer. But in the silence, in the way his hand reached for hers and hovered, just barely brushing her fingers, she knew, from his world, from his family, from himself, that touch, fleeting and fragile, spoke more than apology. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that neither could name. The rain fell without pause over Manhattan, drumming softly against the high windows of Ashland Manor like a sorrowful waltz. The streets below were slick with mist, their gas lamps casting blurred halos in the early twilight. Inside the house, the servants moved like wraiths, quiet, efficient, and always watching. Josephine stood in the west wing, where the walls whispered of history and pride, where the doors remained locked to her until now. Earlier that day, a distracted young servant had left the study door unlatched while delivering correspondence. Josephine, searching for a misplaced volume of poetry, had followed the sound of the wind rustling through a cracked window and found herself standing at the threshold of Theodore's sanctum. She hesitated. The room was richly appointed, but it bore none of the ostentation found in the ballrooms of the city's elite. Dark, leather-bound ledgers lined the walls. Charts of shipping routes and maritime records sprawled across the desk. One globe stood open to the Atlantic, with fine gold pins marking dozens of ports. Curiosity was not a virtue she often indulged, but something within her, stirred by weeks of unease and Evelyn's venomous glances, urged her forward. A sheet of parchment, half tucked beneath a folder, caught her eye. The handwriting was delicate, but the words were anything but. "We must bring the vote forward before the year's end. Theodore's condition will not hold under scrutiny. His new wife is docile for now, but if she begins asking questions, we will lose control. I've secured the medical reports. No one will contest them. Once the board rules him unfit, the shares will pass to the family trust. You, Evelyn, as acting guardian, will execute full control." The blood drained from Josephine's face. The paper trembled in her hand. There was no signature, but the voice behind the ink was unmistakable. She pressed the paper back into place and retreated, heart racing. The house felt colder, the shadows deeper. She returned to her room but could not sit nor rest. Betrayal. It clung to the corners of every hallway. That evening, when the clock struck 9, Josephine went in search of Theodore. She found him in the library, seated near the fire with a book open on his lap, though he clearly was not reading it. His gaze was far away, as though trying to see a future hidden just beyond the flame. "Theodore," she said, softly but firmly. He looked up. "Josephine, I need to speak with you, privately." His brow furrowed. He set the book aside and gestured toward the armchair across from him. "What is it?" She did not sit. "Today I found something. I wasn't looking for it, but it was there." He watched her closely now, every muscle alert beneath the stillness. "There's a letter on your desk, a message from Evelyn, or perhaps someone speaking to her. A plan to call a vote, to declare you unfit." His jaw tightened. He didn't move. She means to take everything, with the board, with falsified reports. She wants to control your empire. The fire cracked in the hearth. Outside, thunder rumbled low. I know, he said at last. Josephine blinked. You knew? His voice was low. Not in those words, not in such bold ink, but I have known for some time what Evelyn wants. And you've done nothing. He stood, slowly. I have done what I could. There are politics involved, Josephine. Allegiances, quiet wars. My health has always been the weapon they use against me. Then why let them? He looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. Weariness, perhaps, or something older. Because to fight them means war. And I have lived my life avoiding battles I could not win. Her hands trembled at her sides. You let them mock me. You let them question my place here, and now you let them dismantle everything you built. He stepped forward. Do you think I wanted this? That I welcomed the day my cousin began speaking for me in boardrooms where my name built the walls? Then why haven't you stopped her? His voice rose, sharp and unguarded. Because I have been sick, Josephine. Because there are days I cannot breathe without pain. Because they treat me as a relic, not a man. She stepped closer, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with fury. And what am I then? A shield, a signature on a contract. I married a man I did not know to save my mother and salvage my dignity, but I will not stand by while you surrender. He stared at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, almost brokenly, he said, You don't understand what it means to be surrounded by people who want you to disappear. I do, she replied, because I live in a house where every glance reminds me I am unworthy. I walk into rooms where no one says my name. I smile through every insult, and I did not run. I did not hide. The silence that followed was thick with everything neither had dared say until now. She turned to leave. Josephine, he said quietly. She stopped. I chose you because I believed you would be strong, he said. Not just kind, not just good, but strong. She faced him again, eyes shimmering with restrained emotion. Then show me that you're worth that strength, she said. Fight for your name, fight for what's yours, or let me go before they destroy us both. She walked away, the echo of her footsteps like a judge's gavel down the marble corridor. Theodore remained alone before the fire, his shoulders hunched, his hands clenched into trembling fists. Outside, the rain poured harder. Inside, walls cracked, not of stone, but of silence. Walls that had long protected pride, but now threatened to bury the man behind them. The Ashworth Palace Hotel stood bathed in gold that evening, a monument of polished marble and gaslight glamour. Its entrance bloomed with carriages and feathered gowns, laughter spilling from beneath velvet awnings as the elite of New York gathered beneath a single commandment, be dazzling or be forgotten, or be... The occasion was Evelyn Ashland's famed winter masquerade, an event whispered about for weeks in the parlors of Fifth Avenue and printed in silver ink on engraved invitations delivered by hand. Josephine had not wanted to go. She had said so plainly when the card arrived, heavy and perfumed, addressed only to her in a flourish of cursive too elegant to be sincere. But Theodore had met her gaze with a silence that was not indifference, but exhaustion. You are my wife, he had said, and you deserve to be seen as such. So now, beneath a mask of pearl-trimmed lace and a gown of deep sapphire silk, Josephine ascended the grand staircase of the ballroom with Theodore by her side, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. Crystal chandeliers trembled above with the vibration of strings and violins. The ballroom shimmered like the inside of a champagne flute, faces blurred beneath feathers and jewels. The air smelled of roses and envy. Theodore's mask was simple, black and unobtrusive, in stark contrast to the elaborate plumage of the men around them. He stood tall, elegant, composed, but she felt the tension in his arm, the silent pressure of a man who hated the stage, yet stood upon it for her. They were greeted with polite nods, murmured flattery, and eyes that wandered too freely. Evelyn found them near the entrance to the ballroom floor. She wore a gown of crimson satin, her mask dripping in ruby crystals. She looked like something painted, not born. "How lovely," Evelyn purred, touching Josephine's gloved hand with icy fingers. "You almost don't look out of place." Josephine offered a smile so measured it could cut glass. "How kind. And you've chosen red tonight, very subtle." Evelyn's eyes glittered beneath her mask, but she said nothing more, drifting away on a tide of admirers and flattery. The evening unfolded in golden threads. Waltzes spun across the floor like falling stars. Conversations danced with veiled compliments and sharper intentions. Josephine remained at Theodore's side, smiling, gracious, every inch the lady they expected to see. Yet, within her, a storm coiled tighter with every glance that lingered too long, every whisper just beyond her ear. It was after the third waltz that Evelyn returned. She carried a folded piece of parchment in her gloved hand. "A note for you, dear," she said sweetly, holding it between two fingers like a perfumed sin. "It was left with the steward. I assume it's from your admirer." Josephine blinked. "My what?" Evelyn smiled. "Do read it aloud. I adore poetry." She pressed the note into Josephine's hand and stepped back. Theodore turned toward her, brows drawn. "What is this?" Josephine opened the parchment with hesitant fingers. The ink was unfamiliar. The words, intimate, passionate, crude almost, a declaration of love, of longing, a confession of nights imagined and days desired. And it was signed, not with a name, but with a mocking symbol, a mask and a question mark. Gasps rippled, whispers began. Josephine felt the heat rush to her face, her throat tightening with panic. "I didn't—" She tried to speak, but her voice caught. She turned toward Theodore, her eyes wide, desperate, but he was already moving. "Enough!" His voice rang, low but thunderous, silencing the circle forming around them. "Whoever left this note is a coward and a liar. And anyone who believes my wife is capable of such deceit is a fool." His arm encircled Josephine's waist with unexpected fierceness. "She came here tonight out of duty and dignity. If that makes her a target, then let your arrows fall on me." The crowd stilled. Evelyn's smile faltered. Josephine could barely breathe. Without another word, Theodore led her from the ballroom. The music resumed behind them, brittle and forced. The masks continued their dance. The ride home was silent. Rain tapped against the carriage windows like an impatient drum. Inside the manor, Theodore did not retreat to his study. He followed Josephine into the drawing room, where the fire still burned low, casting flickers across the dark panelled walls. She stood near the hearth, her hands shaking as she removed her mask. "They all looked at me," she whispered, "as if I were something filthy." He didn't speak at first. He approached slowly, removed his own mask, and placed it on the mantelpiece. "You shouldn't have had to bear that," he said. "Not tonight, not ever." She turned to him, her voice trembling. "They'll believe it. They'll think I invited someone's attention, that I welcomed it. Then let them think what they please," he said softly. "Let them choke on their gossip. You don't owe them anything." She shook her head, eyes brimming. "But I wanted to be worthy of your name." He stepped closer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he did not hesitate. "You are," he said. "You always were, long before they ever heard it." She looked up at him, eyes wide, uncertain. "I'm not dying, Josephine," he said. "I never was." The room froze. He continued, voice low but steady. "I've been ill, yes. I have a condition, chronic. It comes in waves. It weakens me. But it won't kill me. I let them believe otherwise. I let them think I was fragile, that I couldn't lead. And when I married you, I told myself it was for protection. But the truth is," he swallowed hard, "I was afraid. Not of you, of what you might see in me, of being loved and found lacking." She exhaled, her heart beating wildly. "You let me believe you were fading," she said, "that you needed me only as a companion. I needed you," he said, stepping closer, "in ways I didn't know how to name." She reached up slowly, trembling, and touched his face, just beneath his cheekbone, where the mask had rested. "And now," she whispered. He leaned into her touch. "I still need you." Their kiss was not sudden. It was slow, hesitant, born of vulnerability and held breath. It was not of duty or pretense. It was not a reward, nor a transaction. It was a choice. When they parted, they remained close, foreheads touching, hearts unguarded. Outside, the city breathed beneath a sky no longer filled with rain. Inside, beneath the chandelier's last flicker of light, something fragile and fierce had begun to bloom. The arrival of spring in New York was not marked by gentle breezes or the scent of blooming flowers. It came instead with the slow retreat of frost from marble sidewalks, with the distant hum of carriages resuming their constant rhythm along Fifth Avenue, and with the return of social invitations sealed in gold wax and delivered by gloved hands. Ashland Manor, for all its grandeur, remained a fortress of shadows. But inside its high walls and silent corridors, something had shifted. Josephine Carter Ashland now walked the halls with her head held higher. Her gown still bore the grace of modesty, but her presence no longer passed unnoticed. She did not speak more than necessary at the dinners Evelyn arranged, nor did she demand attention, and yet she was beginning to command it. It began with a luncheon hosted by Mrs. Lillian Winthrop, a woman of 60 with silver hair worn in a soft chignon and a voice like porcelain, elegant yet capable of slicing. She had invited Josephine without pretense, without Evelyn's approval, and offered her a seat at a table of wives who had ruled the social circles long before the daughters of railroads and mines arrived with diamonds and loud voices. "I do admire a woman who survives scandal without curling into herself like a dying fern," Mrs. Winthrop had said with a faint smile, sipping her tea. "You stood your ground, Mrs. Ashland. Not many would." Josephine, stunned at first, had answered with quiet gratitude. But inside her something stirred, a warmth, a recognition that perhaps not every pair of watching eyes in the city saw her as an intruder. Some, it seemed, saw a woman worth watching. That same week, a letter arrived by courier. No wax seal, no sender's name. The envelope was plain, the paper heavy. Inside, a single line written in tight, clean script. "The storm around your husband was not born yesterday. Be cautious where you place your trust." There was no signature, no clue, and yet the words struck with the weight of warning. Later that day, as Josephine walked through the offices Theodore had permitted her to begin managing, small, quiet tasks at first, reviewing charitable accounts, organizing port schedules, she found herself unable to shake the sense of being observed. Not by the clerks or the staff, but by something deeper. The memory of that letter whispered to her with every shuffled ledger. "You're thinking too hard again," Theodore said from the doorway, leaning against the frame with a softness that only she was allowed to see. She looked up from the desk, blinking. "It's difficult not to." "You're doing well." The shipping schedule from Baltimore was months behind until last week. She offered a slight smile. "It helps that the men have stopped assuming I confuse cargo ships with tea trays." Theodore entered, stepping around the desk to hand her another stack of papers. Their hands brushed. The contact was fleeting, but their eyes lingered. "There are rumors," she said carefully. "There always are. About the company, about you, about something before me, something unspoken." He hesitated. "The board is divided. Evelyn has always known how to sow fear. But it's not only fear, it's something older, something more fragile." He said nothing. But she saw it, the tension that flared behind his gaze. Before she could ask more, a knock interrupted them. A young man stood at the threshold, holding his hat nervously. He had an ink-stained vest, unruly curls, and the look of someone more familiar with printing presses than with parlours. "Apologies," he said, addressing Josephine. "I was told you might spare a moment. I'm Elias Ford, reporter for the New York Tribune." Theodore stiffened. Josephine stood. "And what brings you to Ashland Shipping, Mr. Ford?" He offered her a folded piece of paper. "You've been mentioned in a few corners of the city, and not all unkindly. I believe there's more to your story than the whispers say." Theodore stepped forward. "This is not the time nor the place." Josephine reached for the paper, scanning the first lines. It was a draft, half an article, half a question. Not about scandal, but about power. About what it meant for a woman like her to navigate the world of men and money. "I don't give interviews," she said, handing it back. "But if you're looking for the truth, I suggest you stop chasing ghosts." Elias gave a small bow. "Fair enough. I only hope you know which ghosts are real." He departed as quickly as he had arrived. Later that evening, Josephine returned to her chambers to find a letter waiting atop her pillow. No handwriting, no mark. Only 5 words, carved in chilling simplicity: "Leave him or be ruined." She sat slowly, hands trembling, breath caught. The edges of the paper were sharp. The ink had smudged, as if written in haste or fury. She stared at the words for a long time. Then she folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer she locked. The next morning, she visited Mrs. Winthrop. "I received something," Josephine confided, sitting across from the older woman beneath a lattice of blooming wisteria. "Something cruel, anonymous." Mrs. Winthrop regarded her with knowing eyes. "You've stepped into a pond where the lilies grow over corpses, my dear. Don't be surprised when one tries to pull you under." "Evelyn," Josephine whispered. "She wants to destroy him. She wants what she thinks is hers," the matron replied, "and she's not alone. But why go through so much to discredit him? Why fabricate illness? Why now?" Mrs. Winthrop poured tea with hands that did not tremble. "Because when power slips through the cracks, people forget decency, and because Theodore's father once made enemies you don't yet know by name." Josephine's chest tightened. "There's more than business at stake," Mrs. Winthrop said. "You know it. You feel it. The question is whether you're willing to open the door wide enough to see what's inside." That night, Josephine stood in the west corridor of the manor, where portraits lined the walls in shadow. Men with Theodore's chin, women with Evelyn's eyes, legacies. She stared at a particular painting, a young man in naval uniform standing on the deck of a ship, eyes hard as steel. "Theodore's brother," said a voice behind her. She turned to find Miriam, the housekeeper. "He died young," Miriam continued, "a scandal they buried before it ever reached the papers. Drowned during a voyage gone wrong, or so they say. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're the only one who ever bothered to see more than what's polished." Josephine returned to her chamber with questions that multiplied in the dark. Who had sent the letter? What had truly happened to Theodore's brother, and why did the past linger so thickly in every room, like smoke that refused to clear? As she extinguished the lamp beside her bed, she whispered into the darkness, "I will not run. Not from secrets, not from power, and not from the man who had begun to trust her with the parts of himself no one else dared to touch." The boardroom of Ashland Shipping was a cathedral of power. Vaulted ceilings, mahogany walls, oil paintings of ships slicing through stormy waters, and a long, polished table that had hosted decades of decisions shaping the empire's fate. That morning the table bore fresh ink, stiff collars, and the kind of tension that couldn't be spoken aloud. Theodore stood at the head of the room, his figure tall yet drawn, the colour in his cheeks more suggestion than presence. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now bore shadows beneath them, shadows that deepened with every passing hour. Josephine stood outside the heavy double doors, fingers laced tightly in front of her, listening to the muffled cadence of voices. Evelyn's voice, measured, serpentine, rose above the rest, masking ambition behind civility. Josephine had not been invited to attend, wives never were, but Josephine Carter Ashland was no longer merely a wife. The meeting stretched. She paced. And then, as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11, the doors flew open. A junior clerk ran toward her, his face ashen. "Mrs. Ashland," he collapsed. She didn't wait for permission. Inside, Theodore lay slumped in a high-backed leather chair, his breathing shallow, one hand clutching the edge of the table. The room had descended into quiet chaos. Evelyn stood frozen near the window, expression tight with something that looked more like inconvenience than concern. Josephine rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, placing a hand against his clammy forehead. "Call for Dr. Bellamy," she ordered, voice calm despite the pounding in her chest. "Now." She looked into Theodore's eyes. He was conscious, but barely. "You'll be all right," she whispered. "I won't let them take anything from you." His lips parted, but no words came. That night the manor was bathed in unnatural quiet. Theodore slept under heavy sedation. Dr. Bellamy had assured her it was not fatal, but it was serious. His body had finally bowed under the weight of weeks of pressure, pain, and betrayal. Josephine stood at the foot of his bed, unmoving. In her hand, she held the same letter she had once found in his study, the one detailing Evelyn's plan to remove him from power. She now had others to match it. Ledger pages, altered reports, signatures that didn't match. And something else. Something Elias Ford had delivered to her in secret that very morning. A sealed envelope containing the original medical report Evelyn had buried. The one that proved Theodore's condition, while chronic, was nowhere near debilitating enough to justify his removal. The next day, the emergency meeting was called. Evelyn had wasted no time. The location was changed, no longer at Ashland Manor, but in a private suite within the Metropolitan Banking Hall. The excuse was decorum. Josephine arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, wearing a slate-grey gown with high collar and matching gloves. Her hair was arranged in a soft chignon. A simple hat sat atop her head. She looked, as Evelyn would later describe her through clenched teeth, like a widow preparing for battle. The room fell silent as she entered. 13 men in dark suits and one woman in crimson silk turned toward her. "Mrs. Ashland," said one of the elder board members, clearing his throat. "We were not expecting—" "I represent my husband in this session," Josephine interrupted calmly. "By his written authority." She laid the document on the table, signed and dated 3 days prior. Theodore's signature gleamed in fresh ink. Evelyn rose slowly. "With respect, Josephine, this is a matter of governance, not domestic concern." Josephine's eyes met hers. "This is a matter of integrity, of legacy, and of law." She placed a second document on the table. "You intend to vote Theodore out on the grounds of mental and physical incompetence. Yet this report, signed by Dr. Marcus Bellamy, states otherwise." Gasps fluttered. "More importantly," Josephine continued, her voice gaining strength, "this original report was replaced by another, one submitted under the same letterhead but altered, falsified." She turned to Evelyn. "And the clerk who processed that document has signed an affidavit stating that it came from your office." The air thickened. One of the board members, Mr. Langston, reached for the document, scanning it with growing alarm. This is a criminal offense," he murmured. But Josephine wasn't finished. She laid out 2 ledgers side by side. "You'll notice discrepancies between projected earnings and declared profits from the last quarter. The forged numbers favored Evelyn's private account." Evelyn paled. "You may call me an outsider, a schoolteacher, a simple woman." Josephine's voice did not tremble. "But I know arithmetic, and I know a thief when I see one." Voices erupted, shouts, questions, objections. The room dissolved into chaos. Josephine stood her ground. She used Theodore's health as a curtain behind which she manipulated this company. She spread falsehoods, forged documents, abused her access. Evelyn slammed her palm on the table. "She has no legal standing," a slow voice answered from the far end of the table. "She does," said Mr. Beaumont, the oldest member of the board, "because Theodore gave it to her, and because the evidence speaks for itself." By noon, the vote had been postponed. A full investigation ordered. Evelyn, pale and silent, left the room without speaking to anyone. Josephine stood in the hallway alone. The victory, though necessary, felt hollow. That evening she returned to the manor. Theodore was awake. He looked at her as she entered, as though unsure whether he was dreaming. "You went," he murmured. She sat beside him, taking his hand. "I had to. You stood before them. For me." "No," she said gently. "For us." A long pause passed between them, a silence full of unshed tears. "I was afraid you would walk away," he said at last. "I nearly did," she whispered. "But you gave me a place in your world. Now I've fought to keep it." He reached for her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek, so softly she barely felt it. "You saved me," he breathed. "No," she said. "We saved each other." Outside, the rain had lifted. The windows glowed with the quiet fire of dusk. Inside, where shadows once ruled, two souls rested at last, not as strangers bound by duty, but as allies shaped by storm. The war they knew was not over, but for the first time they would face it together. The morning unfolded beneath a pale sky, neither rain nor sun claiming dominion. The air in New York carried the kind of tension that clung to windows and whispers alike, a silence heavy with expectation. Inside Ashland Manor, the lamp still burned, though the hour was late. Josephine sat at her writing desk, a sealed envelope trembling beneath her fingertips. The letter had arrived before dawn, unmarked, save for the same heavy parchment and clean, angular script as before. "You have until midnight to leave him. The next time, I'll include a copy of the affidavit, the one that claims you were dismissed from St. Agnes under suspicion, your mother's debts, the young man who visited you after hours. I wonder what the newspapers would make of that. It was a lie, all of it, or at least enough of a lie to become believable." Josephine closed her eyes, the burn of shame not because of what the letter contained, but because of how carefully it twisted the truth. The young man had been a father begging to keep his daughter in school after failing to pay tuition. The debts were real, but they had been settled long before Theodore entered her life. And her dismissal, well, that part had never been written down. She rose from the chair and crossed the room slowly, the letter still in her hand. Outside the window, the garden stretched beneath soft fog, the stone path slick with dew. The silence inside her chambers was profound, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Midnight would come soon enough. She descended the stairs and entered the east drawing room. Theodore sat near the fire, the amber light drawing warmth back into his cheeks. His recovery had been steady, and yet a fragility still clung to the corners of his strength, like the final threads of a storm. When he saw her, he set down the ledger he had been pretending to read. "She's growing more desperate," Josephine said, offering him the letter. Theodore read it once, his face stony, then again slower. When he looked up, his eyes were dark with fury. "She's trying to ruin you. She's trying to isolate you," Josephine corrected gently. "If she makes me leave, you'll be surrounded only by those who serve her. She won't succeed." Josephine stepped closer, her voice quiet. "You must understand, Theodore. If she takes this to the press, there will be no defense. Not in time, not with your name already under scrutiny." "I'll speak to the press myself," he said sharply. "I'll tell them the truth. I'll tell them you—" "No." Her voice was soft, but firm. "You can't be the one to save me this time. It won't work. Not if the world thinks I only stand because you held me up." He looked at her with something between wonder and sorrow. "Then what will you do?" he asked. Josephine walked to the fireplace, dropped the letter into the flames, and watched it curl to ash. "I'll fight fire with dignity." The next day brought unexpected winds of change. The New York Tribune printed a full-column editorial by Elias Ford under the title "The Iron Beneath the Lace, a Portrait of Mrs. Josephine Ashland." It chronicled her modest origins, her steadfast support of her husband through scandal and illness, and her quiet intelligence in restoring order to a crumbling enterprise. It also included quotes from Mrs. Lillian Winthrop, from former students of St. Agnes, even from a rival shipping executive who had once dismissed Josephine as ornamental. Now, he confessed, he saw her as a force of discipline wrapped in silk. The piece spread quickly through the social circles. Morning parlours buzzed with new gossip, not of Josephine's disgrace, but of her courage. By evening, Josephine had received 5 invitations to exclusive luncheons, 3 handwritten notes of admiration, and 1 anonymous bouquet of white irises with a simple card, "Forgive me for ever doubting you." She knew it came from Mrs. Alcott, and it was enough. Still, Evelyn did not yield. She arrived uninvited that afternoon, draped in mourning black, though no one had died, at least not yet. "You've been busy," she said, striding into the salon without waiting to be received. Josephine turned from the window, her hands folded. "Your campaign failed," Evelyn continued. "But don't be mistaken, Josephine. Society's mercy is as fickle as its praise." Josephine smiled faintly. "Then I'll treasure it while it lasts." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You're not clever, you know. You're just lucky." "No," Josephine said calmly. "I'm tired, and I'm no longer afraid of you." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice lowering. "I made this family. I held it together when Theodore couldn't breathe without permission. Do you really think you can erase me?" "I don't need to erase you," Josephine said. "I only need to outlive your cruelty." Evelyn stood still, trembling with the kind of rage that came only from losing something she believed was hers by right. She turned without another word and left the room, her footsteps echoing like a slow defeat. The following morning, the Ashland family board convened once more. This time, not to vote on Theodore's future, but to restructure the company under new leadership. Theodore, now fully present, stood at the head of the table. His words were steady, deliberate. "I have allowed fear to dictate too many decisions. That ends today. I name Josephine Carter Ashland not only my wife, but my official advisor within the company, with access to all operational and financial records. She has already saved us once. I trust her to protect what I no longer can alone." There was silence. Then Mr. Langston cleared his throat. "I second the motion." Others followed. Even the once wavering Mr. Chambers nodded his agreement. Evelyn did not attend the meeting. Josephine sat beside Theodore, her presence neither ornamental nor symbolic, but central. That evening a press conference was held. Theodore, standing before the polished oak facade of Ashland Shipping, addressed the crowd that had gathered under a rising sky. He spoke of truth, of strength, of the damage caused by secrecy and pride. He spoke of Josephine, not as his shield, but as his compass. "She did not marry me for wealth. She did not stay for comfort. She stayed because she saw in me a man still worth saving, and in her I found something I had never possessed. An equal." The crowd hushed. "She is not only my wife. She is my voice, my advisor, and my greatest ally." Applause swelled, tentative at first, then full. Josephine, standing to the side, felt a warmth bloom in her chest. Not pride, not triumph, something deeper. That night, as the city darkened and the household quieted, she entered Theodore's study and found him pouring 2 glasses of wine. "For you," he said. She took the glass. "To survival." He shook his head, lifting his glass toward hers. "To victory." They clinked glasses, and for the first time since that letter had arrived, Josephine laughed. It was not a laugh of relief. It was the laughter of a woman who had crossed fire unburned, and who now stood, not beside a man who needed protection, but beside a man who had learned to fight for her just as fiercely as she had fought for him. Late summer wrapped New York in a golden hush. The city, ever restless, moved more slowly under the weight of heat and new beginnings. Along Fifth Avenue, carriages passed beneath the shade of carefully manicured trees, their wheels muffled by dust, their passengers shaded by parasols and reputation. Inside Ashland Manor, light streamed through tall windows left open to catch the breeze, stirring curtains of ivory lace. The air smelled of lemon balm, fresh ink and rosewater. Silence no longer held the house hostage. Laughter, soft, unforced, now moved through its halls like music remembered from childhood. Josephine Carter Ashland walked the gallery with a stack of correspondence in her hands, pausing before the tall arched window that overlooked the inner garden. Below, her mother sat among the hydrangeas, gently fanning herself with a lace-edged handkerchief, a straw hat tilted just slightly over one ear. Agnes had colour in her cheeks again. Her breath came easily. The physician visited less and less. Peace had found its place among them. Josephine turned from the window, her steps echoing down the corridor as she returned to the study she now shared with Theodore. The desk was cluttered. Papers, maritime reports, letters of investment. But there was always space for a fresh bouquet. Always space for her. He sat reading near the window, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a pair of spectacles resting at the bridge of his nose. He looked younger in the morning light, less like the Empire's heir, and more like the man she had come to know in quiet moments, when duty did not hover over them. 3 more confirmations for tonight, she said, setting the letters down. Mrs. Winthrop, Elias Ford, and rather unexpectedly Lady Ashton. Theodore raised an eyebrow. The same Lady Ashton who once called you a charitable curiosity. Josephine smiled. The very one. He set the book aside and reached for her hand, drawing her gently to his side. And what do you think of this sudden affection from the city's finest? I think, she said, folding her fingers over his, that some reputations are rebuilt one insult at a time. He chuckled softly, bringing her hand to his lips. Then you've built a palace. That evening, Ashland Manor opened its doors to the highest echelons of New York society for a gala unlike any it had ever hosted. But this was no glittering tribute to money or lineage. The invitation had been clear. An evening of gratitude in honor of Mrs. Josephine Carter Ashland, whose unwavering dignity has redefined legacy. The ballroom, once a place Josephine had entered with trembling breath, now shimmered beneath her vision. The chandeliers had been cleaned until they gleamed like stars. The string quartet played a waltz she had chosen herself. The floor was waxed to a gleam, and the flowers, white lilies, blue forget-me-nots, and pale pink roses, filled the air with the scent of memory and renewal. She descended the grand staircase slowly, Theodore waiting at the foot, his gaze steady and reverent. He wore black and silver, formal yet simple. His cravat was tied with quiet elegance, and at his lapel sat a single white iris, the flower she had once received in silence. She, by contrast, wore deep sapphire silk, not the blue of sorrow, but of the sea at dawn. Her gown fell like water around her, embroidered at the hem with silver thread in a pattern of branches reaching upward. A symbol, some said, of all she had endured. To her, it was simply a tree that refused to bend. When she reached him, Theodore offered his arm. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She looked out at the crowd, people who had once doubted her, whispered about her, dismissed her as a temporary anomaly. "I've been ready for a long time," she said. The first toast came from Mr. Langston, whose usually gruff tone softened as he spoke of resilience, loyalty, and the way Josephine had defended not only her husband, but the soul of the company. The second came from Mrs. Winthrop, who addressed the room without a note in hand. She is not merely Theodore's wife. She is not simply Mrs. Ashland. She is herself. And that, my friends, is far more difficult to become in this world than a lady of name. There was no applause, only a silence so respectful it bordered on reverence. Josephine, standing beside Theodore, felt no need to speak. Her silence now spoke louder than a speech ever could. After the toasts, The music resumed. Theodore led her to the center of the floor. They danced slowly, surrounded by candlelight and the scent of lilies. His hand rested lightly at her waist, his touch familiar, yet never careless. Her hand settled in his, not as a formality, but as belonging. "Are you thinking of the first time we danced?" he asked, voice low. She smiled. "You mean when we stood frozen near the back wall, pretending to sip champagne while avoiding eye contact?" He laughed quietly. "Exactly. I was terrified," she confessed. "I was in awe," he said. They moved together with the ease of those who had already survived the worst. Their rhythm was not perfect, but it was honest, and that was enough. Around them, society watched. And this time, Josephine did not feel their judgment. She felt their acknowledgement. Some clapped politely, some smiled softly, a few even nodded with respect. She rested her head gently against Theodore's shoulder. "I never imagined this," she whispered. "What did you imagine?" he asked. "A quiet life, teaching, watching my mother grow older, fading away in a room full of books and regret." He held her closer. "You were never meant to fade." Dim. They danced until the music slowed, until the candles burned low, until the guests thinned and the night became quiet once more. Later, long after the last guest had gone and the house had returned to stillness, Josephine stood at the same window where she had once stared out, uncertain and alone. She heard footsteps behind her. Theodore joined her, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders. "Cold?" he asked. "No," she said, "not anymore." He followed her gaze toward the night, the city stretching beyond the garden, like a sea of possibilities. "Everything is different," she said. "No," he murmured. "Everything is just as it should have been." She turned to him then, her hand against his cheek, her gaze steady. "What we have," she said, "was not built on grand gestures. It was carved from silence, from pain, from choosing each other when it would have been easier to walk away." He nodded. "That is the foundation of an empire. A tomb." Their kiss was tender, unhurried. It carried no promise of forever, no poetry, only the weight of having endured, and the quiet joy of what remained. And there, beneath the moonlight, in the house that had once felt like a stranger's fortress, Josephine understood something not even love could fully explain. She had not married an empire. She had helped build one, not of ships and ledgers, but of trust, of quiet strength, of hearts no longer hidden. The empire of the heart. Autumn had returned to New York, cloaking the city in burnished gold and the crisp promise of change. Leaves drifted from the trees that lined Fifth Avenue, spinning gently to the ground like memories loosened by time. The Ashland manor, now softened by age and affection, stood not as a symbol of wealth, but of something more enduring. Inside, the fire crackled in the drawing room, where once Josephine had felt like a trespasser. Now it bore the marks of living, children's books stacked by the hearth, a silk shawl draped over a chair, and the gentle sound of laughter echoing from the hallway. Josephine sat by the window, a worn journal open in her lap. The lines on her face had deepened, gracefully like ink settling into fine parchment. Her hair, still the color of warm chestnut, was pulled back with quiet elegance. She looked not like a woman reaching for her youth, but one who had lived it fully. She turned at the sound of small footsteps. "Mama!" cried a boy of 7, his dark curls bouncing as he raced into the room. Behind him, a girl, just past 5, followed with a ribbon in her hand and mischief in her smile. "Henry," she said, catching the boy in her arms, "did you climb the apple tree again?" "No," he said, breathless. "It was Ellie." "I only climbed the first branch," the little girl protested, spinning on one toe. "Papa said that doesn't count." Josephine shook her head, unable to hide her smile. "We'll speak with Papa about that." At that moment Theodore appeared in the doorway, older, yes, with silver at his temples and a slower step, but his eyes still lit the same way they had that first night he had dared to dance with her in public. "You'll speak with Papa about what?" he asked, feigning suspicion. "Tree climbing," she said, rising. "Ah." He looked at the children. "Then I plead guilty." The 4 of them laughed together, a sound that carried up the staircases and into the corners of the house that once held only silence. After the children had been ushered off for their evening reading with Agnes, now in her 80s, but still sharp-tongued and fiercely beloved, Josephine and Theodore returned to the garden, now dimly lit by lanterns. The same garden where she once feared exposure now held their wedding anniversary parties, their children's first steps, and quiet mornings with tea and plans. The empire had changed. Ashland shipping had modernized, expanding into new markets, embracing steam and innovation. Josephine had become a respected figure in business and philanthropy. Her counsel sought even beyond the confines of the company. She founded a school for girls in the city's working districts and served as its patron, ensuring no young woman would be dismissed for being poor or plain or inconvenient. Theodore, once seen as frail, had grown into his role with measured strength. He no longer let others speak for him. His voice, steady and resolute, was now one of New York's most respected. And Evelyn? She had left the city 6 years ago after her final attempt to oust Theodore failed in full public view. She had lost her seat on the board, her influence, and the loyalty of those who once feared her. Rumor had it she lived in Boston now, surrounded by mirrors and regrets. Josephine had no bitterness toward her, only a quiet sorrow for the choices Evelyn had clung to. They reached the bench beneath the old oak tree, now surrounded by climbing roses. Theodore sat first, pulling Josephine gently to his side. 8 years, he said. 8 years, she echoed. And still, you choose me. Every morning, she said, resting her head against his shoulder. They sat in silence for a while, the cool breeze moving between them like an old friend. You know, he said quietly, I sometimes wonder if we would have found each other without that arrangement. She smiled faintly. I don't think we would have seen each other, really seen. I was too guarded, and you were too alone. He nodded. Then I'm glad fate forced our hand. Fate, she murmured, or Evelyn's ambition. He laughed softly, and the sound made her chest tighten with something like joy and sorrow intertwined. A carriage passed in the distance, its lamps glowing softly. In the world beyond their garden, society had shifted. Women now spoke more boldly. Marriages were formed less from convenience, more from hope. The old rules had not vanished, but they no longer felt immutable. Josephine looked toward the house, their home. The place that had once felt like a gilded prison now pulsed with warmth and life. She thought of the girl she once was, the one who signed her name to a marriage contract with trembling hands and no idea what waited on the other side. I was afraid, she whispered more to herself than to him. You were brave, he corrected, and perhaps both were true. As the moon rose over New York, casting silver light across their hands, they remained there, two souls who had weathered illness, betrayal, ambition, and fear. Their love was no longer a secret nor a rebellion. It was not a fairy tale. It was something far more extraordinary. It had endured. And in the quiet rhythm of their joined lives, in the laughter of their children, the warmth of their household, the legacy they were building beyond ships and titles, Josephine understood what she had always longed to believe. That love, when chosen day after day, could become the most powerful empire of all. When Josephine first stepped into Ashland Manor, she was a woman with nothing but dignity to her name. And yet, through storms of betrayal, class prejudice, illness and fear, she built something far greater than a title or a fortune. She built a love that endured. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength does not come from status, but from the quiet courage to remain kind when the world is cruel, to hold your ground when your heart is breaking, and to choose love even when it seems impossible. If you've stayed with us until the very end, write the word empire in the comments to let us know you were here. It helps more than you think, and it lets us see just how many hearts this story has touched. And if Josephine and Theodore's journey moved you, we invite you to share this story with someone who believes in second chances and love that grows stronger with time. We have more emotional period romances waiting for you, full of resilience, passion, and unforgettable characters. Just check the cards at the top of the screen or visit our channel for more timeless tales. Thank you for being part of this story. And remember, sometimes the most powerful empires are built not from stone or steel, but from the quiet strength of the heart.